The championship victory, Marcus Chen stood in the center of the dojo, his black belt wrapped firmly around his waist, sweat glistening on his forehead as he bowed to his sensei. At 28 years old, he had just claimed his third consecutive regional karate championship. And the taste of victory was as sweet as ever. The trophy gleamed under the fluorescent lights, reflecting not just his skill, but years of dedication, discipline, and sacrifice. "Excellent work, Marcus," Sensei Yamamoto said, his weathered hands clasping behind his back. "Your technique has improved significantly since last year's competition." Marcus nodded respectfully. But inside, his chest swelled with pride. He had defeated every opponent with precision and power, earning points not just for his technical prowess, but for his aggressive fighting style that had become his signature. The crowd had cheered his name, and local newspapers had already reached out for interviews. Social media was buzzing with videos of his final match, where he had delivered a spectacular spinning kick that left his opponent stunned. After changing out of his GI, Marcus walked through the parking lot toward his sleek black motorcycle. The evening air felt cool against his skin, a welcome relief after hours of intense physical exertion. His phone buzzed constantly with congratulatory messages from friends, family, and fellow martial artists. Each notification fed his growing sense of superiority as he mounted his bike. Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the chrome. The man staring back at him looked invincible. 3 championship titles, a successful martial arts school that he had opened 2 years ago, and a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. Students flocked to his classes, eager to learn from someone who had proven himself in competition. Repeatedly, the ride home took him through the wealthier part of town, where tree-lined streets hosted elegant mansions behind ornate gates. Marcus had grown up in a much humbler neighborhood, where his single mother worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. His success in karate had been his ticket to a better life, and he wore that achievement like armor. His apartment, while modest compared to the mansions he passed, represented everything he had worked for. Trophies lined the shelves, certificates covered the walls, and photos captured moments of triumph from various competitions. But tonight felt different. Tonight, he felt like he had reached a new level, not just in skill, but in status. Marcus spent the evening replaying the day's matches in his mind. Each victory had been decisive, each opponent clearly outmatched. The local karate community had acknowledged him as their strongest competitor, and there was talk of sponsorship opportunities that could take his career to the next level. Professional fighting organizations had begun to take notice, and his phone had been ringing with offers from managers and promoters. The next morning, Marcus woke with the same sense of invincibility. He dressed carefully, selecting a fitted shirt that showed off his athletic build and designer jeans that spoke to his growing financial success. His morning routine included an hour of training in his home gym, where he practiced the same combinations that had served him so well in competition at his martial arts school. Students gathered around him like disciples around a master. They hung on his every word as he demonstrated techniques, their eyes wide with admiration and respect. Marcus found himself enjoying the attention more than usual, feeding off their reverence like fuel for his ego. Sensei Marcus. One of his younger students asked during a break between classes, "What's it like to be unbeatable?" The question struck Marcus oddly. Unbeatable. Was that what he had become? The word rolled around in his mind as he continued teaching, but it felt accurate. 3 championships, hundreds of victories in smaller tournaments, and a technique that seemed to improve with every competition. When was the last time he had truly been challenged? During lunch, Marcus decided to take a ride through the city center. The championship trophy sat securely in his bike's storage compartment. He planned to display it prominently in his school's front window that afternoon. The sun shone brightly, and the streets buzzed with typical midday activity as he navigated through traffic. Marcus noticed how other drivers seemed to give him extra space, perhaps recognizing him from local news coverage or social media posts. At red lights, he caught people in neighboring cars stealing glances, some even pointing him out to their passengers. The recognition felt intoxicating. His route took him past the city's government district, where important buildings stood with formal guards and security measures. Marcus had never paid much attention to this area before, but today he found himself curious about the people who worked in these impressive structures. Politicians, judges, high-ranking officials, people with real power and influence. The afternoon training session at his school went exceptionally well. His students seemed more focused than usual, perhaps inspired by his recent victory. Marcus pushed them harder than normal, expecting excellence because he had achieved it himself. The intensity in the dojo was palpable, with students giving everything they had to meet their instructors' elevated expectations. As evening approached, Marcus felt a restless energy building within him. The day had been good, but somehow not quite satisfying enough. The victory, the recognition, the admiration of his students, all of it felt like it needed something more to be complete. He decided to take another ride, this time with no particular destination in mind. The city looked different from his motorcycle seat, especially as the sun began to set and the lights started to come on. There was something about being in motion, about the power of the machine beneath him and the power he had demonstrated in the ring. That made him feel truly alive. Marcus found himself thinking about the future. Where would his success take him next? International competitions, professional fighting circuits, perhaps even movies or television, like some martial artists had managed to achieve. The possibilities seemed endless, limited only by his imagination and ambition. The evening air grew cooler as he rode, but Marcus barely noticed. His mind was too occupied with visions of greater victories, larger trophies, and wider recognition. He had worked hard to reach this point, sacrificed much, and overcome obstacles that would have stopped lesser men. Tonight, riding through the city as a newly crowned champion, he felt like he was finally claiming his rightful place in the world. Little did Marcus know that his next ride would take him down a path that would challenge everything he believed about himself, his abilities, and what it truly meant to be strong. The championship trophy secured in his bike's compartment would soon be the least significant thing about his identity, and the lessons waiting for him would prove more valuable than any prize he had ever won. The encounter 3 weeks after his championship victory, Marcus had settled into a routine that felt almost royal. Morning training sessions were followed by interviews with local media outlets. Afternoons were spent teaching increasingly large classes at his school, and evenings often included appearances at martial arts events, where he was treated as a celebrity guest. The attention had begun to change him in ways he didn't fully recognize. Where he once focused intensely during training, he now found himself glancing toward mirrors more often, admiring his form. Where he once listened carefully to feedback, he now nodded politely, but rarely internalized suggestions for improvement. Success, it seemed, created an invisible barrier between him and the humility that had originally driven his development. On this particular Thursday evening, Marcus decided to explore a different part of the city. His usual routes had become predictable, and he craved something new to match his elevated status. He chose to ride through the diplomatic quarter, where embassies and consulates lined pristine streets, and where security was notably more visible and sophisticated than in other areas, the buildings. In this district spoke of international importance and old-world elegance. Flags from dozens of countries fluttered in the evening breeze, and the architecture suggested both wealth and power. Marcus felt drawn to this atmosphere, as if his recent success had earned him the right to move in such elevated circles. As he rode slowly through the tree-lined streets, Marcus noticed the security presence was indeed more substantial than elsewhere. Professional guards in formal uniforms stood at attention near various entrances, their posture and equipment suggesting serious training and responsibility. Some were clearly local police, but others wore uniforms he didn't recognize, presumably representing different nations' security services. The quiet dignity of the area impressed him. Unlike the bustling commercial districts where he usually spent his time, this neighborhood seemed to operate according to different rules. People walked more deliberately, conversations appeared more serious, and there was an overall sense that important matters were constantly being discussed and decided. Marcus pulled over near a small park to observe the scene more carefully. From his vantage point, he could see several embassy buildings, each with its own distinctive architectural style and security arrangements. The guards moved with professional precision, their eyes constantly scanning for potential threats, their communication devices crackling occasionally with quiet updates. One building in particular caught his attention. It was smaller than some of the others, but its design suggested significant importance. The flag hanging outside bore colors and symbols he didn't recognize. But the building's security arrangement was impressive. 2 guards flanked the main entrance, while others patrolled the perimeter at regular intervals. What fascinated Marcus most was the obvious competence of these security personnel. They moved with a confidence and awareness that reminded him of his own presence in the dojo. But there seemed to come from different sources. Whereas confidence came from victories and trophies, there seemed rooted in serious responsibility and genuine training for real-world situations. As he watched, Marcus began to feel a strange competitiveness stirring within him. These guards looked capable, but were they really as skilled as everyone assumed? His recent championship had proven his superiority over other martial artists. But how would his abilities measure against these supposedly elite security professionals? The thought intrigued him more than it probably should have. Marcus had always been curious about how his tournament skills would translate to real-world situations. And here was an opportunity to observe professionals who dealt with actual security concerns rather than sporting competitions. A movement near the building drew his attention. A horse and rider were approaching from a side street, moving with the kind of formal precision that suggested an official function. The horse was magnificent, a large, well-groomed animal that carried itself with obvious training and conditioning. The rider wore an elaborate uniform that seemed to combine elements of military dress with ceremonial decoration. Marcus watched as the horse and rider approached the building he had been observing. This was clearly some kind of official arrival, perhaps a diplomatic function or ceremonial event. The guards at the building straightened their posture even further, if such a thing was possible. And prepared to receive what was obviously an important visitor, the horse moved beautifully, its gait controlled and elegant. Marcus, who had always appreciated physical conditioning and training, found himself admiring the animal's obvious fitness and the rider's skillful control. This was clearly the result of years of dedicated training, not unlike his own martial arts development. As the horse drew closer to the building, Marcus noticed something that struck him as almost amusing. For all their impressive appearance and serious demeanor, these security guards were positioned around a horse. Marcus had spent years learning to defend against human opponents who could think, strategize, and adapt their techniques. How difficult could it be to deal with a large animal that, despite its training, operated primarily on instinct? The thought was ridiculous, he knew, but it lodged in his mind anyway. His recent victories had proven his superiority over human opponents who had trained for years specifically to defeat people like him. Surely his speed, technique, and proven ability would give him significant advantages in any physical situation, even one involving such an unusual element as a trained horse. Marcus shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. He wasn't here to cause trouble or prove anything to anyone. He was simply enjoying a peaceful ride through an interesting part of the city, observing the kind of formal atmosphere that his success was beginning to make accessible to him. But the competitiveness wouldn't leave him alone. Every time he looked at the guards, he found himself analyzing their positioning, their awareness, their apparent skill level. They looked professional, certainly, but did they have the kind of tested abilities that he had proven in competition after competition? Had any of them ever faced the kind of pressure he had handled in championship matches, where split-second decisions and perfect technique made the difference between victory and defeat? The horse and rider completed their approach and stopped near the building's entrance. The ceremony, whatever it was, appeared to be beginning. Guards adjusted their positions, and Marcus could see additional personnel moving inside the building, visible through large windows that had been left open to the evening air. From his position across the street, Marcus had a clear view of the entire scene. The horse stood calmly but alertly, obviously well-trained and accustomed to formal situations. The rider dismounted with ceremonial precision, and several officials emerged from the building to begin what appeared to be some kind of official greeting or reception. Marcus found himself focusing more and more intently on the horse. The animal was undeniably impressive, but it was still just an animal. It might be trained, disciplined, and valuable, but it lacked the human intelligence and adaptability that made martial arts opponents truly challenging. His mind began working through scenarios, almost involuntarily calculating angles, timing, and techniques. The evening was growing darker, and Marcus knew he should probably head home. His training schedule for the next day was demanding, and he had promised to meet with a potential sponsor who was interested in supporting his progression to professional competition. But something about this scene held his attention, as if fate had brought him to witness something significant. As he prepared to start his motorcycle and leave, Marcus took one last look at the impressive scene before him. The uniformed officials, the ceremonial atmosphere, the obvious importance of whatever was taking place. It all represented the kind of elevated world that his success was beginning to open to him. Perhaps someday he would be invited to such events, recognized not just as a regional champion, but as someone worthy of international attention and respect. The horse shifted slightly, and the movement caught Marcus's eye once again. For just a moment, he allowed himself to wonder what would happen if someone with his proven abilities decided to test themselves against this obviously elite security arrangement. Not to cause harm or create real problems, but simply to see if championship-level skills could overcome whatever advantages these professionals might have. The moment of arrogance. Marcus returned to the diplomatic quarter 3 more times over the following week, each visit feeding his growing obsession with the scene he had witnessed. During his second visit, he learned from a nearby cafe owner that the building housed the consulate of a small European nation, and that the horse ceremonies were part of their traditional diplomatic protocols. Dating back centuries, very important people, the cafe owner had explained in broken English. The horse, she is special. Trained from birth for ceremonies. Very expensive, very precious to them. This information only heightened Marcus's interest. The horse wasn't just a ceremonial prop. It was a valuable, specially trained animal that represented significant investment and cultural importance. The security around it would presumably be even more sophisticated than he had initially assumed. During his third visit, Marcus had observed the guards more carefully. They were indeed professionals, but he noticed something that surprised him. While they were obviously well-trained in standard security procedures, their attention seemed focused primarily on human threats. They watched crowds, monitored approaches to the building, and maintained communication with each other about potential risks from people. But when it came to the horse itself, they seemed to rely heavily on the animal's own training and the handler's expertise. The horse was treated as a partner in the security arrangement, rather than something that needed to be protected from external interference. This struck Marcus as potentially naive, though he kept the thought to himself. On his fourth visit, Marcus arrived just as the evening ceremony was beginning. This time, he had positioned himself differently, closer to the action, but still maintaining what he considered a respectful distance. The horse and rider approached with their usual dignity, and the guards took their customary positions as he watched. Marcus found his competitive mind working more actively than ever. The horse, despite its obvious training, moved in predictable patterns. The guards, despite their professionalism, seemed to have established routines that could potentially be exploited by someone with the right combination of speed, technique, and timing. Marcus began to see the entire setup as a kind of complex martial arts problem. In tournament fighting, he had learned to identify patterns in his opponent's techniques, to spot the moments when they were committed to particular movements and therefore vulnerable to counterattacks. Looking at this ceremony with the same analytical approach, he began to see similar opportunities. The horse's movements, while elegant, followed specific patterns that seemed designed more for visual impact than for defensive flexibility. The guard's positioning, while professionally arranged, assumed threats would come from predictable directions and follow conventional approaches. And the timing of the entire ceremony followed a rhythm that, once observed, became almost mathematically predictable. For the first time, Marcus began to seriously consider what would happen if someone with his abilities decided to test this system. Not to cause real harm, he told himself, but simply to prove that championship-level martial arts skills could overcome even elite security measures. The thought wasn't malicious. It was competitive. driven by the same instincts that had made him a successful fighter. As the ceremony concluded and the horse and rider prepared to depart, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Next time, he wouldn't just observe. Next time, he would test himself against what everyone assumed was an unbeatable security arrangement. The decision felt natural, almost inevitable. His recent championship had proven his superiority over other martial artists. His school was thriving because students recognized his exceptional abilities. Media outlets sought his opinions because he had demonstrated expertise that set him apart from ordinary practitioners. Why shouldn't he test himself against this next level of challenge? Marcus spent the following 2 days planning his approach with the same methodical attention he brought to tournament preparation. He studied the timing of the ceremonies, analyzed the guards' patrol patterns, and calculated the physical dynamics involved in the horses, movements, and the riders' control techniques. The plan that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. During the ceremony's most predictable moment, when the horse stood still while the rider dismounted, Marcus would make a rapid approach, deliver a single, precisely controlled strike to the horse's flank that would startle it without causing injury, and then withdraw before the guards could effectively respond. The strike itself would be perfectly safe. Marcus had spent years learning to control his techniques with surgical precision, and he knew exactly how to apply just enough force to create the desired effect without risking harm to the animal. The goal wasn't to hurt anything or anyone, it was simply to demonstrate that his skills could penetrate what everyone assumed was impenetrable security. More importantly, the demonstration would prove something Marcus was becoming increasingly certain of, that his championship-level abilities had applications far beyond tournament competition. If he could successfully challenge diplomatic security, what other opportunities might open up for someone with his proven capabilities? Friday evening arrived with perfect weather. Marcus dressed in dark, flexible clothing that would allow full range of motion while making him less visible in the evening shadows. He arrived at his observation point 30 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, giving himself time to confirm that everything was proceeding according to the patterns he had observed. The guards took their usual positions. The horse and rider appeared on schedule, moving through their familiar approach route. The ceremonial officials emerged from the building at precisely the expected time. Everything was proceeding exactly as Marcus had observed during his previous visits. As the ceremony began, Marcus felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that preceded his tournament matches. His heart rate increased slightly, his breathing deepened, and his focus narrowed to the specific task ahead. This was the feeling he lived for, the moment when all his training and preparation would be tested against a real challenge. The horse and rider reached their designated position. The rider began the formal dismounting process. Following the ceremonial protocol that Marcus had now witnessed multiple times, the guards maintained their positions, their attention focused outward on potential threats from the surrounding area. Marcus moved from his observation point with the fluid, silent precision that had made him a champion. His years of training had taught him not just how to fight, but how to move with maximum efficiency and minimum wasted motion. Each step was calculated, each movement designed to bring him closer to his target while remaining undetected by the security. Personnel: 30 feet from the horse, 20 feet, 15 feet. The animal was focused on the ceremony, standing calmly while the rider completed the dismounting process. The guards were maintaining their established positions, their attention directed away from the immediate vicinity of the horse itself, 10 feet. Marcus could see every detail of the horse's conditioning, the rider's ceremonial uniform, the precise positioning of the guards. Everything was exactly as he had planned. In 3 more seconds, he would demonstrate that championship martial arts skills could overcome any security arrangement, no matter how sophisticated or professional. 5 feet. Marcus coiled his body like a spring, preparing to deliver the precisely controlled strike that would startle the horse without harming it, proving his point and establishing his capabilities at a new level. His technique was perfect, his timing was flawless, and his confidence was absolute. At exactly the moment Marcus had planned, he struck. The shock Marcus's strike connected with the horse's flank with perfect precision, exactly as he had planned. The controlled blow was designed to startle, not injure, and in that respect it succeeded completely. The horse reared up with a surprised whinny, its front hooves pawing at the air as it tried to understand what had happened. But what Marcus hadn't anticipated was the chain of events his harmless demonstration would set in motion. The rider, caught completely off guard by the horse's sudden movement, lost his grip on the reins and tumbled backward. His elaborate ceremonial uniform, designed more for appearance than for practical horseback riding, tangled around his legs as he fell. He hit the pavement hard, his ornate hat rolling away as he cried out in pain and surprise. The horse, now thoroughly panicked, began to rear and buck more violently. Its training, which Marcus had assumed would keep it controlled, proved inadequate in the face of an unexpected attack from an unknown direction. Instead of calming down, the animal became increasingly agitated, its hooves striking dangerously close to the fallen rider and several ceremonial officials who had rushed forward to help. The security guards reacted with professional speed, but their response was exactly what Marcus should have expected from truly elite personnel. Instead of confusion or delay, they moved as a coordinated unit. Within seconds, 3 guards had surrounded Marcus, their weapons drawn and their commands sharp and clear. On the ground, now, hands where we can see them. Marcus found himself face down on the pavement faster than he could process what was happening. His championship reflexes, so dominant in tournament settings, seemed useless against opponents who weren't following tournament rules. These weren't competitors looking for points, they were professionals, dealing with what they perceived as a serious security threat. The weight of a guard's knee pressed into his back while his hands were secured behind him with restraints that made resistance impossible. The concrete was cold against his cheek, and he could taste dust and grit in his mouth. This wasn't how his demonstration was supposed to unfold around him. The chaos continued. The horse was still agitated, requiring multiple handlers to bring it under control. The fallen rider was being attended to by medics who had appeared with remarkable speed, and Marcus could hear him groaning in pain. Officials were shouting in what sounded like multiple languages, and the ceremonial atmosphere had been replaced by emergency response procedures. "What's your name?" The guard kneeling on Marcus's back spoke with crisp authority. "What organization are you with? Why did you attack the ceremony?" "Attack the ceremony?" Marcus tried to speak, to explain that it hadn't been an attack, just a demonstration of skill. But with his face pressed against the pavement and adrenaline flooding his system, coherent words seemed impossible to form. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't part of the plan. Additional security personnel arrived, along with what appeared to be local police and other officials Marcus couldn't identify. Radio chatter filled the air as reports were made and additional resources were called in. The simple, elegant demonstration Marcus had planned had become an international incident involving multiple agencies and potentially serious diplomatic consequences. As he was lifted to his feet, Marcus caught sight of the horse for the first time since his strike. The animal was finally beginning to calm down, but dark marks on its flank showed where his harmless blow had connected. What he had intended as a controlled, precise technique had clearly been more forceful than he had realized. The horse was injured. The rider was being helped to his feet, but he was obviously hurt. His left arm hung at an awkward angle, and his face was pale with pain. The ceremonial uniform that had looked so impressive was now torn and dirty, and there was blood on his forehead where he had struck the pavement. Marcus's mind reeled. As he tried to understand what had gone wrong, his technique had been perfect, his control precise, his planning meticulous. But the results were nothing like what he had intended. Instead of demonstrating his superior abilities, he had caused injuries, created chaos, and apparently triggered serious security protocols that he hadn't even known existed. Move. The guard behind him wasn't interested in explanations or delays. Marcus found himself being marched toward vehicles that had appeared with the same sudden efficiency as everything. And this security response, the casual observer role he had played during his previous visits, was over. Now, he was the center of attention in ways he had never imagined. As they walked, Coots could see other officials examining the scene with professional thoroughness. Photographers were documenting everything from multiple angles. Investigators were measuring distances and taking notes. What had been a moment of impulse was being treated as a serious crime that required comprehensive evidence collection. The vehicle they placed him in was unlike any police car Marcus had seen. The interior was designed for transporting people who were considered significant security risks. With reinforced separation between front and back seats and restraint systems that made movement virtually impossible. This wasn't standard law enforcement. This was something much more serious. During the ride, Marcus tried to piece together what had happened and why his carefully planned demonstration had gone so completely wrong. He had studied the guards, analyzed the horse's training, calculated the timing perfectly. His martial arts skills were proven in competition. His technique was championship level. How had everything gone so badly? Gradually, Marcus began to realize that he had made assumptions that proved to be dangerously naive. He had assumed the horse would react like his tournament opponents, with surprise but basic control. He had assumed the security personnel would respond like dojo partners, with recognition of his skill and respect for his technique. He had assumed that his championship abilities would translate directly to real-world situations. Every assumption had been wrong. The horse hadn't reacted like a human opponent because it wasn't a human opponent. It was a large, powerful animal whose panic responses were driven by instincts that had nothing to do with martial arts, training, or sporting protocol. When startled, it didn't step back and reset like a tournament competitor. It exploded into unpredictable, dangerous movement. The security guards hadn't responded like impressed observers because they weren't observers. They were professionals whose job was to prevent exactly the kind of action Marcus had taken. Their training wasn't designed to appreciate his technique. It was designed to neutralize threats quickly and effectively, regardless of how skilled those threats might be in other contexts. And his championship abilities, which had seemed so applicable to this situation during his planning, had proved nearly useless once real consequences replaced tournament rules. In competition, points were awarded for clean technique and controlled contact. Here, his perfect technique had injured an animal and a person, created an international incident, and landed him in custody faster than he could react. The building they brought him to was intimidating in its understated professionalism, unlike police stations he had seen on television. This facility spoke of resources and capabilities that existed at levels far beyond local law enforcement. The people working here moved with the same quiet efficiency he had observed in the diplomatic quarter, and their equipment suggested access to technology and training that most people never encountered. As it was processed through what appeared to be intake procedures, Marcus began to understand that his demonstration had consequences he had never considered. This wasn't just a matter of disturbing the peace or trespassing. He had interfered with diplomatic security, injured personnel involved in official ceremonies, and apparently violated laws that carried penalties he had never imagined. The reality of his situation was starting to sink in, and with it came the first real cracks in the confidence that had driven him to this moment. For the first time since he had begun winning tournaments, Marcus found himself facing a situation where his proven abilities not only didn't give him advantages, but it actually made everything worse. He was no longer a champion demonstrating superior skills. He was a suspect in custody, facing consequences that his martial arts training had never prepared him to handle. The lesson begins. Marcus sat in the holding room for 6 hours before anyone came to speak with him. The space was unlike any cell he had imagined, clean, well-lit, and equipped with basic amenities, but unmistakably designed to contain people who were considered serious security risks. The walls were thick enough to muffle outside sounds almost completely, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the growing realization of how badly he had misjudged everything. During those long hours, Marcus replayed the incident over and over in his mind, each review making his situation clearer and more frightening. The horse's injury, the rider's fall, the coordinated response of the security team, all of it had happened so quickly that he was only now beginning to understand the full scope of what his demonstration had caused. When the door finally opened, the man who entered was not what Marcus expected. Instead of an interrogator or police detective, he faced someone who looked more like a professor or a diplomat. The man was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and calm eyes that suggested both intelligence and experience. He wore a simple suit, carried no visible weapons, and moved with a quiet confidence that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of his old sensei. "Mr. Chen," the man said, settling into the chair across from Marcus with unhurried precision. "My name is David Morrison. I represent the security service responsible for protecting the ceremony you disrupted." Marcus tried to find his voice, to offer explanations or apologies, but Morrison raised a gentle hand to stop him. "Before you say anything, I want you to understand your situation completely," Morrison continued. "The horse you struck suffered bruised ribs and will require several weeks of recovery. The rider, Ambassador Kellner, has a dislocated shoulder and a concussion. The ceremony you interrupted was part of a formal diplomatic negotiation that has now been postponed indefinitely." Each fact hit Marcus like a physical blow. What he had intended as a harmless demonstration of skill had caused real injuries, disrupted important international business. The gap between his intentions and the actual results seemed impossible to bridge. "You're facing charges of assault, interference with diplomatic proceedings, and violation of international security protocols," Morrison said. "In other circumstances, you would already be in federal custody. The penalties could include several years in prison." Marcus felt his world collapsing. Prison, criminal charges, international incidents. None of this had been part of his plan, and his championship skills offered no defense against legal consequences he had never considered. However, Morrison continued, and Marcus looked up with desperate hope. "Ambassador Kellner has made an unusual request. Despite his injuries, he is asked to speak with you personally before any final decisions are made about prosecution." This was so far from what Marcus expected that he couldn't immediately respond. The man he had injured wanted to speak with him. Why would a diplomatic official want to meet with someone who had disrupted his ceremony and caused his injury? "I don't understand," Marcus finally managed to say. Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with those calm, intelligent eyes. "Ambassador Kellner comes from a country with very old traditions regarding martial arts and personal honor. He believes that your actions, while reckless and illegal, were motivated by something other than malice. He wants to understand what drove an accomplished martial artist to make such a catastrophically poor decision." The word catastrophic echoed in Marcus's mind. That's what his demonstration had become, not a proof of skill, but a catastrophic failure of judgment that had hurt innocent people and created consequences he was only beginning to understand. "Will you speak with him?" Morrison asked. Marcus nodded, though he had no idea what he could possibly say to explain or justify what he had done. An hour later, Marcus found himself in a different room, this one more like a conference facility than a holding area. Ambassador Kellner was seated at a round table, his left arm in a professional sling and a bandage covering part of his forehead. Despite his injuries, the man's presence was commanding, and his eyes held an intensity that made Marcus feel exposed and vulnerable. "Sit down." "Mr. Chen," the ambassador said in accented but perfect English. Marcus took the offered chair, struggling to meet the ambassador's gaze. This was the man he had injured, the person whose important work he had disrupted with his arrogant demonstration. "I have been informed that you are a martial arts champion," the ambassador began. "Three-time regional winner, owner of a successful school, respected in your community for your fighting abilities." Marcus nodded, though his achievements suddenly felt hollow and meaningless in this context. "I, too, have some experience with martial arts," the ambassador continued, and Marcus looked up in surprise. "In my country, I trained for 15 years in traditional fighting techniques. I competed in national tournaments and earned recognition for my skills." This revelation caught Marcus completely off guard. The injured diplomat across from him was also a martial artist. "That is why I wanted to speak with you personally," Ambassador Kellner explained, "because I recognize the arrogance that led to your actions tonight. I see it because I once suffered from the same arrogance myself." The words hit Marcus like cold water. Arrogance. The ambassador was calling him arrogant. And somehow the accusation felt more accurate than any description Marcus might have chosen himself. when I was your age, and winning tournaments regularly, I began to believe that my fighting skills made me superior to other people, the ambassador continued. I thought that because I could defeat other martial artists in controlled competitions, I could handle any situation that required physical capability or mental toughness. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The ambassador's words described his own thoughts with uncomfortable accuracy. I made a decision very similar to yours, Ambassador Kellner said quietly. I decided to test my abilities against what I perceived as an inferior challenge. In my case, it was during a public festival in my home city. There was a demonstration by local police, showing their crowd control techniques. I convinced myself that my tournament skills made me superior to their training. The ambassador paused, touching his injured shoulder gently. I approached one of the officers during the demonstration and challenged him to what I thought would be a friendly sparring match. I was certain I would prove my superiority easily. Marcus found himself leaning forward despite his discomfort. This story was striking uncomfortably close to his own experience. The officer was a 20-year veteran who had dealt with real violence, real threats, real consequences every day of his career, the ambassador continued. When I made my move, expecting him to respond like a tournament opponent, he responded like a professional dealing with an actual threat. What happened? Marcus asked quietly. He put me on the ground in less than 3 seconds. Using techniques I had never encountered in any tournament, the ambassador said. More importantly, he did it in front of hundreds of people who had come to watch a peaceful demonstration. I had turned a community event into a spectacle of my own arrogance. Marcus felt heat rising in his cheeks as he recognized the parallels to his own situation. But that was not the worst part, Ambassador Kellner continued. The worst part came afterward, when I had to face the consequences of my actions. Legal consequences, social consequences, and most importantly, the realization that my martial arts training had taught me techniques, but it had not taught me wisdom. The ambassador stood up carefully, favoring his injured arm, and walked to the window. The horse you struck tonight has been in ceremonial service for 8 years. She has participated in diplomatic ceremonies in 12 different countries. Her training represents thousands of hours of careful work, and her role in our diplomatic traditions goes back centuries. Marcus felt shame washing over him in waves. He had thought of the horse as simply an obstacle to overcome, not as a living being with value and purpose beyond his personal demonstration. The ceremony you interrupted was the culmination of 3 years of careful negotiation between my country and yours, the ambassador continued. Trade agreements that would benefit thousands of people, cultural exchanges that would strengthen relationships between our nations, educational programs that would provide opportunities for young people in both countries. Each word made. Marcus's actions seemed more thoughtless and destructive. He had been so focused on proving his own abilities that he had never considered what he might be disrupting or destroying. But I am not telling you this to make you feel worse than you already do, the ambassador said, returning to his seat. I am telling you this because I believe, as I once needed to believe about myself, that you are capable of learning from this experience. Marcus looked up, surprised by the note of compassion in the ambassador's voice. When I was humiliated by that police officer, I had 2 choices, Ambassador Kellner explained. I could blame everyone but myself, make excuses, and continue to believe that the world had failed to recognize my superiority. Or I could accept that my martial arts training had taught me fighting techniques, but had failed to teach me about respect, humility, and the responsibility that comes with physical capability. Which did you choose? Marcus asked. Initially, the first option, the ambassador admitted. For several months, I convinced myself that the officer had been lucky, that the situation had been unfair, that my skills were still superior. But eventually, the truth became impossible to ignore. The ambassador leaned forward, his eyes meeting Marcus's directly. Real strength, Mr. Chen, is not about defeating opponents in controlled competitions. Real strength is about understanding when not to fight, about using your abilities to protect rather than to prove, about serving something larger than your own ego. Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes as the ambassador's words cut through years of accumulated pride and arrogance. Everything he had built his identity on suddenly seemed shallow and misguided. The horse you injured tonight represents centuries of tradition and thousands of hours of patient training. The ambassador continued. The ceremony you disrupted represents years of careful diplomatic work. The security personnel you challenged represent dedication to protecting others rather than glorifying themselves. I never thought about any of that, Marcus whispered. Of course you didn't, the ambassador said gently. Because your martial arts training, as excellent as it may be technically, apparently never taught you to think beyond your own achievements and capabilities. The criticism was devastating because it was accurate. Marcus realized that every decision he had made, from his initial observations of the ceremony to his final decision to strike the horse, had been focused entirely on what he could prove about himself, with no consideration for anyone or anything else. So what happens now? Marcus asked. Ambassador Kellner was quiet for a long moment, studying Marcus with those penetrating eyes. That depends on what you choose to learn from this experience, and how you choose to demonstrate that learning, the true champion. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same diplomatic quarter where his world had changed forever. But this time, he wasn't there as an arrogant observer planning some misguided demonstration of superiority. He was there as a volunteer, helping to prepare for another diplomatic ceremony, one that would hopefully proceed without the chaos he had caused half a year ago. The transformation in Marcus's life had been as complete as it was humbling. Ambassador Kellner's offer had been both generous and challenging. Instead of pressing criminal charges, he would sponsor Marcus in a program designed to teach martial artists about the broader responsibilities that came with their abilities. The program would last 6 months and would require Marcus to completely restructure how he thought about strength, skill, and service. The first month had been the hardest. Marcus had been required to work directly with the stable that cared for the horse he had injured. Every day he spent hours learning about the animal's needs, her training, her role in diplomatic ceremonies, and the careful attention required to maintain her health and conditioning. The horse, whose name was Duchess, had initially been terrified of Marcus. His presence had caused her obvious distress, and it had taken weeks of patient, gentle interaction before she would allow him to approach without showing signs of panic. Working to rebuild that trust had been more challenging than any tournament he had ever faced. She remembers everything, Lena, the head trainer, had explained during his first week. Horses don't forget traumatic experiences easily. If you want to help her recover, you'll need to prove that you can be trusted every single day, through your actions rather than your intentions. Learning to earn Duchess's trust had taught Marcus more about real strength than all his championship victories combined. It required patience, consistency, gentleness, and the ability to put someone else's needs ahead of his own ego. There were no judges awarding points for technique, no crowds cheering for impressive displays of skill, just the slow, careful work of rebuilding something that his arrogance had broken. The second month had focused on understanding the diplomatic work that he had disrupted. Ambassador Kellner had arranged for Marcus to work with the cultural attache's office, helping to prepare materials and coordinate logistics for international events. The work was detail-oriented and required the kind of sustained attention and collaborative effort that tournament training had never demanded. Diplomacy is about building bridges, the attache, Ms. Rodriguez had explained. Every ceremony, every meeting, every formal interaction is part of a larger effort to create understanding and cooperation between different peoples. When someone disrupts that work, they're not just causing temporary inconvenience. They're potentially damaging relationships that took years to build. Marcus had spent countless hours learning about the specific negotiations he had interrupted, the cultural significance of the ceremonies he had dismissed, and the patient, careful work required to restore confidence after his actions had created doubt and concern. The complexity and importance of what he had thoughtlessly disrupted had been overwhelming. The third month had been spent working with the security personnel he had challenged. Instead of seeing them as opponents to be overcome, Marcus learned to understand them as professionals dedicated to protecting others. He trained alongside them, learning techniques that had nothing to do with defeating opponents and everything to do with preventing conflicts and ensuring safety. Real security work, Sergeant Martinez had explained, is 90% prevention and 10% response. Our goal is never to prove how tough we are, it's to make sure nothing bad happens to the people we're protecting. Training with the security team had shown Marcus how narrow and limited his martial arts perspective had been. These professionals used their physical skills in service of others, not for personal glory or competitive advantage. Their strength was measured by their ability to prevent problems rather than to create impressive displays of technique. The 4th and 5th months had involved direct service work in the community. Marcus had volunteered at youth centers, teaching basic self-defense while emphasizing respect, discipline, and responsibility. He had worked with elderly residents at assisted living facilities, helping with physical therapy and mobility exercises. He had assisted at community events, providing security and crowd management with the same professionals he had once thought he could surpass. Every day of service had reinforced the same lesson. Real strength was about what you could do for others, not what you could do to others. The most impressive displays of skill meant nothing if they weren't directed toward helping, protecting, or serving people who needed support. Now, in his 6th month, Marcus was preparing for his final evaluation. Ambassador Kellner would assess whether Marcus had truly learned from his experience or whether the lessons had been superficial and temporary. The evaluation would take place during an actual diplomatic ceremony, not unlike the one he had disrupted. But with Marcus serving as part of the support team, rather than as an outside observer, his job would be to help ensure that everything proceeded smoothly and safely. With no attention drawn to himself or his role as Marcus prepared for the ceremony, he reflected on how completely his understanding of martial arts had changed. His technical skills were actually better than they had been 6 months ago, but now they were informed by wisdom, humility, and a deep understanding of responsibility. His students at the martial arts school had noticed the changes immediately. Marcus now taught not just techniques, but the philosophy and ethics that should guide their use. He emphasized service over competition, protection over aggression, and character development over winning records. A black belt, he now told his students, repeating words Ambassador Kellner had shared with him, is not a sign that you have learned to fight. It's a sign that you have learned when not to fight, and that you understand your obligation to use your abilities in service of others. The evening of the ceremony arrived with perfect weather, just as it had 6 months ago. But this time, Marcus was inside the security perimeter, wearing the uniform of a volunteer coordinator, focused entirely on ensuring that the diplomatic proceedings would unfold without incident. Duchess, the horse he had injured, was once again part of the ceremony. She had recovered completely from her physical injuries, and her trust in humans had been gradually rebuilt through careful, patient work by her trainers and caretakers, including Marcus himself. As the ceremony began, Marcus watched from his position among the support staff. The same guards who had once restrained him now worked alongside him as colleagues. The same ambassador who could have sent him to prison now trusted him to help protect similar events from disruption. The ceremony proceeded flawlessly. The horse and rider moved through their traditional patterns with elegant precision. The diplomatic officials conducted their formal business with appropriate dignity. The security personnel maintained their protective posture without drawing attention to themselves. Marcus's role was small, but important. He helped coordinate the logistics that kept everything running smoothly, communicated with various support teams to ensure proper timing, and remained alert for any potential problems that might require attention. When the ceremony concluded successfully, Marcus felt a satisfaction deeper than any tournament victory had ever provided. This wasn't about proving his own capabilities, it was about contributing to something larger and more important than himself. Ambassador Kellner approached Marcus as the cleanup process began. The older man's shoulder had healed completely, and his manner was warm rather than formal. "How do you feel about tonight?" the ambassador asked. Marcus thought carefully before answering. "Grateful," he finally said. "Grateful for the opportunity to serve. Grateful for the trust you've placed in me." and grateful for everything I've learned about what real strength means." Ambassador Kellner smiled. "And how do you see your martial arts training now?" "As a tool for service," Marcus replied. "The techniques are the same, but the purpose is completely different. My strength isn't measured by who I can defeat. It's measured by who I can protect and help." "That," said Ambassador Kellner, "is the lesson I hoped you would learn. The same lesson I had to learn many years ago, and the lesson that transformed me from a tournament fighter into someone capable of serving others," as they walked together toward the diplomatic building. Marcus realized that his real martial arts education was just beginning. The championships he had won were footnotes compared to the understanding he had gained about honor, service, and the true meaning of strength. 6 months ago, he had thought of himself as a superior fighter who deserved recognition and respect. Now he understood that he was a student who had been given the privilege of using his abilities to serve others, protect the vulnerable, and contribute to something greater than his own ego. The transformation was complete, but the journey of service and learning would continue for the rest of his life. Marcus Chen was finally, truly a champion, not because of the tournaments he had won, but because of the character he had developed and the service he was committed to providing. And that, he now understood, was what martial arts had always been meant to teach.